Good afternoon and welcome to a brand spanking new segment, rather obviously titled In Conversation With, a segment specially designed to showcase the backstories of individuals who have made an impact. Now, who can resist an hour of tete-a-tete over a cup of tea on a Saturday afternoon? Well, during this hour, we will delve into a conversation around the stories that really need to be told of modern day icons. Luminary Learning Solutions crafted this segment so you, our audience, can be inspired to truly thrive. I'm Anton Thayalan, the Chief Evangelist and co-host this hour, and I'm being joined in by our founder and destiny architect, my partner in crime, Vidusha Nathavitharana, the host for this afternoon, and we will take you through an hour of free-flowing discussion. For today's segment on In Conversation With, it is my privilege to introduce Lisa Bodell, who is an award-winning author and CEO of FutureThink. She was recently selected as one of the top 50 keynote speakers in the world. As a futurist and expert on the topic of innovation and simplicity, she serves as a Global Council member of the World Economic Forum and has helped thousands of senior leaders ignite innovation in organizations such as Bloomberg, Lockheed Martin, and many more. Lisa is an inspired global speaker who has brought her message to over 30 countries and nearly 100,000 people each year. She was ranked the top speaker at Google's client events in 2016, and she's also the author of 2 award-winning best-selling books, Why Simple Wins in 2016 and Kill the Company, End the Status Quo, Start an Innovation Revolution, which won the 2019 North American Book Award for Best Business Book and was also voted as the best business book by the USA Book News and Booz & Co. Lisa is an advisor on the boards of Association of Professional Futurists and was also on the Novartis Diversity and Inclusion Board in Basel, Switzerland. Among her many academic activities, Lisa has taught innovation and creativity at both American and Fordham universities in the US. On that note, a very good afternoon, Lisa, and welcome to the show, and thank you for your time. How are you doing?
Great, thank you for the kind introduction. You can introduce me anytime, Anton.
Always a pleasure, Lisa. Lisa, just to set context to our conversation, and we're always fascinated by the many leaders that we have on the show, right? We'd like to take you back to your normative years, and I really mean even before the accounts executive at Leo Burnett.
Oh boy.
Tell us about how growing up was.
Well, you know, it's interesting because people always say, well, what did you know when you were growing up that you wanted to do what you're doing now? And the answer was no, because it really wasn't a thing. No one said to me when I was little, like, do you want to be a futurist when you grow up? It wasn't a topic. But I do know there are some skills, you know this from having a learning organization, that started to bubble up early on. And I started to do more and more of them. I was always very entrepreneurial. I was always very creative, and I was always a good teacher. And I remember when I was little, the first time I was very entrepreneurial, I was bored. You know, my parents were working and I was playing outside, and I decided, well, I'm going to make some money because I wanted to buy some toys. I must have been, I don't know, 6 or 7 at the time. And we had a rock garden out in front of our house. And I decided to take these rocks, bring them inside, and of course, paint them all different colors. I put them in a basket and decided, well, I'm going to sell these to my neighbors because who wouldn't want to buy a rock, you know? What a dumb thing. So I took all these rocks that I had painted with faces and things to my neighbors, and they would give me, you know, here in the United States, I grew up in a state called Michigan, and they would pay me 10 cents, 20 cents, whatever, for all these rocks. I thought I was rich. I thought I had just struck gold. And so that was my first time when I thought, God, I can create things and sell it. And so that really kind of started it at a very young age. And as I got older, I went to school for creativity and marketing, and I then took courses in entrepreneurship, and I decided, I don't want to work for somebody else. I eventually want to do this on my own and create my own stuff and sell it. And that's kind of what happened. You know, it's like when you have those times that are bored when you're younger and you start to figure things out, that's the genesis of what a lot of our our future, where it comes from. And so selling rocks is really how I got started.
Can I jump into the term futurist?
Yeah.
What or who is the futurist?
So, and everyone laughs because they think futurist means like a business psychic, right? Someone who predicts the future for a business. And it's not that at all. Actually, it's a real degree and title you can get. Typically, it's a master's in science, and you can study it at lots of places. My people teach it, my futurists, at, for example, the University of Houston. A lot of oil and energy companies are there, and they use futurists to predict drilling sites 50 years out. There's a study of foresight and futuring in Leeds in the UK, in Singapore, they're all over. And the idea of a futurist is to help people understand and anticipate change. And how you do that is teach people how to keep their antenna up, like to detect these signals, and then to figure out which of those signals are possible, probable, and preferable. And that's really the key, because a lot of things are possible, but they're not preferable. And so we have to teach people what that means. As long as you're on top of it, then you can decide if you want to act on that signal or you want to protect yourself against it. That's what futurists help you do.
And what got you interested in that? Because it's not something, I hate to use the word not normal, but you know what I mean? Just generally growing up, I mean, one gets, especially in our parts of the world, if you're doing the sciences, then where you want to be a doctor. If you want to do the arts, you end up being a lawyer. If you can't do either one of them and you're entrepreneurial, you start your own business. You don't necessarily think of being a futurist as a career option. So no. What got you into that?
I had an employee that was telling me about it very early on when we were in our 20s. And he said, I met this guy at a conference and he's a futurist. And I said, it was strategic luck, basically, that someone said this to me, and I am a seeker. So I sought out this person and I said, I've got to meet this person. Because most people hear about things or they read about things, but they don't pick up the phone and call people and learn about it. And people love to talk about themselves. So pick up the phone, they're probably going to want to talk to you. So I talked to this futurist and he told me what he did. He worked for a company called Dow Chemical, right? Now part of Cargill. And he said, I'm there to help them determine the future. And I said, how do you do that? And so he taught me all about it. He got me involved in all these associations. And I really liked it because it was a creative way to approach business. So that's how I looked at it, is I didn't want to just do regular business and be an account person or be a business person and run a product. I wanted to come up with new things. And he's the first person that showed me that that is a job and something that was growing and necessary in companies, because tech was emerging and people were starting to realize that the future was not a fixed point. It was something that we could create rather than having it put upon us. And he opened the doors for me to become a futurist. I studied it and now I teach it.
It's also one of those things when you have that title of a futurist. And I've been meaning to ask this question from a lot of people, because in the kind of work we do strategic planning and so on and so forth. And one of the first things that you have to do is do scenario building or environmental analysis and look at the probability and the, in case that does happen, what are you supposed to do and so on and so forth. But 9 times out of 10, most businesses or most organizations overall, I think, even though you do that, you almost do it like an academic exercise, isn't it? Because it's something that you're expected to do, but no one takes it seriously until it happens, and then we panic, and then we start reacting to it, like COVID. And I must share this story because we work very closely with the garment industry and the apparel manufacturing. And when we first heard, obviously in the news there was news about a possible pandemic, and Wuhan had been on lockdown and so on and so forth. But we haven't heard of Wuhan until COVID anyway, so it's out there and nobody bothered about it. But we did get insights from colleagues and friends working in China that there was a distinct possibility that this was not going to be contained within China. And chances are it just might become a global pandemic. And this is probably about a good month and a half, 2 months before it ever reached the shores of Sri Lanka. Now, most organizations that we work with do have strategic plans. Most of our organizations are used to having things like chickenpox and measles outbreaks. And so we are used to being in confined spaces when these things happen and respond to it in kind because it's an AC environment and it spreads quite easily and so on and so forth. But the penny doesn't drop. And even though we've done our risk analysis and even though we have looked at it from a very academic perspective, you don't really have systems and processes in place to really react. Why is that?
So to me, it's less about the systems and it's more about the skills. So I think people have the systems in place because they like consistency. So that's the problem with systems, is it does create consistency and speed, but when there's something brand new, if they can't follow that process, then it becomes more about the skills. And so when you have things like COVID, right, and the coronavirus, then you need to have people that are agile because no 12-step program exists for it. And I think one of the problems with strategic planning is you're right, we don't take it seriously. And because of that, we aren't able to come up with a serious plan in times of deep change. I make a joke about strategic planning, actually, that everyone says they're all about doing big strategic plans. And I said the way strategic planning typically starts in a company is somebody's assigned to start it, one of the leaders or managers. They open up last year's PowerPoint deck that they presented. They change the date to this year and they save the file. And then strategic planning has begun. We've opened up the PowerPoint. Now it's time to fill in the blanks. And it's the dumbest thing. We do these dumb things that are more political than strategic. So, SWOT analysis, obviously. So people are always looking at their strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And it's a bunch of BS. It's strengths. Everyone has lots of strengths. We've got to load as many strengths as possible. Weaknesses, then we defend why they're not really weaknesses, maybe they're opportunities. We're just moving things around the quadrants and it doesn't accomplish anything. And so this is where the futuring part of me comes in. The futurists are there to provoke change. And the way that you get a better strategic plan is to bulletproof your company and be honest about it. And we came up with this pre-strategy activity called Kill the Company. That was my first book. And the idea is before you strategic plan, you better figure out what's not working so you can make space for more things that are. And we taught people that they had to pretend they are their number one competitor. And, they decide who it is. And they then wear that hat and they have an hour or 2 hours, whatever it is, to act like that competitor and try and put your business unit or company out of business. And you have to attack it from the outside. So where are we weak? How would we take down those products? How would we steal those teams and get their skill sets? How would we acquire a company and become better than them? All these, how would we underprice them and put them out of business? And what it reveals are all your weaknesses and then makes you really figure out how to fix those rather than, spending 5 weeks on a SWOT analysis that just defends your current position. So I think just kind of bringing this around, I think the problem people had with COVID is they weren't being very honest with their strategic plans. And they were focused on a process, not the skills. The great thing about coronavirus and what you all were telling me before we started this interview was, you really had to refigure out business in COVID. And you did it because not just you were forced to, but you had the skills to be more creative about it. You challenged your assumptions. And that's what things like wildcards and coronavirus do, is they challenge our assumptions around how we work and they force us to stop being in a rut. Many people don't realize the difference between a groove and a rut. So they think they're in a groove because it feels good, but they're really in a rut. And the problem is they can't tell the difference because they feel the same. And until something really explodes like coronavirus and shakes them out of it, they stay in a rut. And I think what you guys are talking about with coronavirus is it's forcing people to get in a new groove, and that's cool.
True that. But it must be hard work, isn't it, from a job perspective?
Yes.
Getting that message across isn't easy. How do you cope with that? The frustration of it.
It's interesting you said this, and I know we were talking about this before. People are, it's hard to change. People don't like it. We like to protect ourselves. So when something in terms of change comes up, our brainstem gets activated. We want to protect ourselves. Is this good or bad? And we're usually taught to analyze any change as bad first to protect ourselves. And so people resist it. And when it's brought on so urgently and out of the blue, like coronavirus, these black swans, people resist it even more. So it's how do you get people comfortable with change? Because change equals fear. How do you set new norms that establish trust in a remote work environment? That's a big thing for leaders, is establishing trust, because it's all that trust was established in person, and now we have to trust people remotely. And we have to constantly communicate, because just because people say it once doesn't mean that it persists. People aren't good with habits. So I think the more that you can model it, that you can establish norms and you can communicate it, that's how you can start to get people to change, even in the most extreme times. You've seen really great companies, like yours, that are able to pivot, because when they rally around a problem together and they trust each other, it becomes a good thing. When there's no trust, there's fear, and it's a bad thing. So leaders play a really important role right now.
Lisa, you mentioned killing complexity a little earlier, but I know one of your themes has been that complexity was actually killing organizations or killing businesses, which then brings me to a point that the opposite of that should be simplicity or simplifying your business, right? But how important is simplifying the business? How important is it for you, and how powerful is it in reality? Is that possible?
I would say it's probably one of the most important things you do, because complexity is the enemy of meaningful work. So if you're operating with complexity during COVID, you can't pivot. Right? People are operating in fear. They don't know what's supposed to be happening. They're drowning in unnecessary work. And so you lose focus and you can't move fast enough. Complexity slows you down. So even before COVID, companies that were operating with simplicity were more competitive, and they were more focused and could move faster, because they knew that it wasn't about doing more. It was about doing valuable. And so the most simple companies are the ones that can disrupt industries when you're not looking. And it's interesting, because think about like Uber, right? They make it simple for you to get a car, or Airbnb made it simple for you to get a room, or Netflix for us made it simple for you to rent movies. People that operate with simplicity reduce the friction and can move faster than big complex companies can. And that's the problem with some of these big companies. When they rely too much on process and not enough on skill, they can't pivot fast enough. And in a world that operates on speed and focus, if they operate with complexity, they will lose. So there's so many obvious benefits to simplicity, but what big companies don't realize is they think size is more important than speed, and that's not the case anymore. So if they don't embrace simplicity, they're going to lose.
Can I just interject on that? Because a lot of times, I personally, it's one of those little mantras I keep muttering all the time. Even at home, make it simple, make it simple, make it simple. Yeah. But oftentimes, especially in an organizational setting, because I've sat on the other side of the fence for many years as well, so I can empathize with that. We fear simplicity simply because we think it's trivial. And
yeah.
You know what I mean? The moment it's simple, we tend to misunderstand it to being trivial. So I want to draw that line where we're not talking of the trivial. At the same time, it is not to say that things aren't complex.
That's right.
But it doesn't mean that you're to complicate it. And we don't differentiate between the two. So we assume that just because it's complex, it needs to have a complicated answer. And I think that's where most organizations just miss the bus, isn't it? You can find simple answers to complex situations if you look for it hard enough.
I agree. And I think this is the thing where I'll hear that a lot, where people will say, well, not everything can be simple. And the answer to that is, of course, you're right. I mean, heart surgery isn't simple. Putting a man on the moon isn't simple. But if you made that overly complex, they never would have gotten there. So, let me give you an example. There's a lot of ways to think about simplicity. And the idea of simplifying is to make it as simple as possible. That's the key, because you can oversimplify as well. And that's where it becomes a negative effect. But, when you think about simplicity, people think about it as just minimizing or getting rid of things. But simplicity can also be making something more understandable or clarity. It can be making something more repeatable, right? So there's a system to it, or it can be making things more accessible and transparent. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. And I always talk to people about, think about a pilot that goes into a cockpit. It is very complex, but they are trained on it and they make it as simple as possible so that when they have to fly the next airplane, they don't have to relearn how to fly. So that's what we're trying to tell people is there are things that are complex, but let's make them as simple, transparent, understandable as possible so we can avoid unnecessary complexity.
I want to bring you as a person into this. Do you need to be? Do you need to be of a certain type to make things simple? Is that embedded in our kind of DNA, so to say, or our behaviors, or our traits, or personality types? Is that something that you need to consider? Because I find that when you interact with people, some people are innately or instinctively, they can cut through all the nonsense and get down to being very clear. Others just can't, they have to have been taught how to do that. So is that something you were literally born with? You could always see it that way, or you kind of taught how to sift through and be able to see things simply?
So I think everyone can be simplified. They can simplify. Yeah. They just need to know how. Some people are more natural at it than others, just like there's natural artists, but you could teach me to draw. So, right, I am naturally born with the ability to simplify. It's what I do, so I can teach it. And what's good about that is I can teach you some simple things and tricks that will help you hack your work and change your behaviors so you can learn how to do it. So the good news is everyone can simplify. We just have to give them the tools and the framework to do it. The other thing that's cool about it and why leaders love it is simplicity. It's not just about efficiency, it's very ethical, right? The reason it's ethical is, first of all, simplicity is free. It doesn't cost you anything to do it. So right there, people love it, right? It doesn't cost you anything to simplify, really, right? If I tell people to kill stupid rules at their company, they don't have to hire, they can hire me if they want, they can hire you, but they can do that on their own, right? That's easy. They just didn't know they could do it. And that's cool. That gets them back time and money and all this stuff. But the real thing that it does that's ethical is it makes people feel that their time is valued. And, we get really mad when people waste our money, but we don't get mad when people waste our time. And we should, because you'll never get it back. And this is the reason why simplicity is so important. It is something we can learn. We all want to spend our time on more valuable things personally, right? So I think we all have a drive to simplify. We have a drive to be more transparent, and we know that it's ethical for us, so we want to do it. I just want to teach people how, so they can start trying it on their own. What's natural to you is not natural to others, but that doesn't mean they can't do it. We just got to give them some tips to get them started.
I'm just going to pick up on what Vidusha asked, Mary. Lisa. Somewhere, I can't quite remember where, and I read that you were being called the Marie Kondo of the corporate simplicity. So, and I think Vidusha is nailed it with that question, but I do want to know, on that note of being Marie Kondo of corporate simplicity, and you just said, organizations need to understand this, that they can do things on their own, but which then dives into the corporate culture, right? How does that work? I mean, how important is it in terms of fostering this within the corporate culture, that simplicity is a requirement, that it does have its benefits? But how do you get that in? How important is it, and how do you get that message across?
What a great question. It is incredibly important. And I think that simplicity needs to become not just our new operating system. That's a great way for people to think about it. But simplicity is your culture. Because when you think about it, culture is the work that you do every day. That's it. So, I mean, you can tell me that it's about happiness and mindfulness and all this other junk, but I don't buy that. I don't think that's true. I think culture is the work you do every day. And I also don't believe, by the way, that companies are made up of one culture. I think they have cultural norms, but my culture is really my boss and the group that I operate within every day. Right? Most people don't talk to their CEO every day. The culture is the group they operate in and the work they do every day. So if the work you do every day is meetings and emails, that is your culture. If the work that you do every day is brainstorming and meeting with customers, that is your culture. So I think that simplicity allows you to focus on what meaningful work is and better slot where you spend your time. So I feel very strongly that simplicity is the culture, and it will help us define meaningful work.
Thank you for that. And for those of us, or for those of you who are joining in now, we are in conversation with Lisa Bodell, the award-winning author and CEO of FutureThink, in an hour of designed to bring inspiration through the backstories of modern-day icons. On that note, Lisa, thank you for that. I know Vidusha had a question, and I'm going to pass that over to him.
No, I was itching to ask this because 9 times out of 10, when we do consulting work, we often say that these are things that are innately you sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that organizations do. But oftentimes you find that we would do, say, a budget for a department or an organization, but we rarely do a budget for ourselves as individuals or as families. We have a vision for the company, but it's very rare to find families sitting around and asking, what should our vision be? Where should we be in 5 years?
Great point.
And I think simplicity is another one of them. I think it's fantastic to bring that kind of thinking and concept to families as well, because I think we complicate, life in general. We complicate relationships. We complicate rearing children. We complicate the hell out of everything we do. So simplicity from a personal perspective. Do you teach that too, as in, or is it mostly for corporates?
I absolutely love that you asked this question, because when I was writing my book, I wrote a chapter on how it translates to simplifying your life, and my publisher pulled it. And they said, no, this is a business book, right? Keep it business. And my argument was, and I think I was right, by the way, was that, there's no difference between work and life anymore. I mean, look at us with COVID now. Like it's not a thing. Like you can't just say work stops now and here's life. Like it constantly blurs. So the fact that we want to simplify, I think it has to start with our personal life. And it's really interesting for us to find what's meaningful to us, because, on one instance, yeah, you want to do meaningful work, but at the end of the day, it's less about what you care about at work. It's more about what you're working for, and that's your personal life. So one of the things I talk about in terms of exercises for people to simplify is I tell them to try it on themselves first and then try it at work. And so some of those things are very simple. Let me tell you a couple of them. So one is killing stupid rules, which is so easy, right? But rules are really not rules. They're assumptions. Most of the things that bog people down at work are obligations, assumptions, things they didn't realize they couldn't do. It's the same thing at home. Most of the things that you spend your day doing that you don't like are obligations or assumptions around how you think you have to work. I mean, people working from home now has totally changed their home life, and they had to figure it out, right? They never questioned those assumptions until they were forced to. So we tell people what kinds of rules or things would you kill in your personal life if you could. Another thing that we teach people to do that's really interesting is we have them take a T-chart. And on the left-hand side, we have them label it common tasks. And on the right-hand side, we have them label it what I wish I was doing. And on the left-hand side, they have to write down 20 things that they typically do in a week with their time. And they should be specific, you know, don't just say driving a carpool, taking my kids to school, making dinner. Be specific. And you have to come up with 20 typical things. If it feels hard, you're doing it right. It's supposed to make you uncomfortable and even piss you off a little bit. And when you look at that list, when you're done with the 20, you should reflect on it and circle the things on that left-hand side, your typical tasks that you think are valuable. And what you find with people, the same thing happens when you do it with your team at work, by the way. What you find with people is they don't circle many things. And so the first reaction is, of the few things you circled, what do they have in common? And that really helps you define valuable. And then of the things that aren't circled, the question you have to ask or have someone else ask you, because we're always good at defending things we shouldn't, is why are you doing those things? If they're not circled and they're not valuable, why? Because those are the things that you should get rid of. Because then you want to make space for the things on the right-hand side, which is I wish. And in other words, that's meaning or meaningful. And you have to write down 20 things that you wish you were doing, 20. They can be small or they can be large. And what you find is on the left-hand side, after you do this exercise of the T-chart, those are things that are obligations or things that are draining to you personally. The things on the right-hand side are things that are valuable to you and inspiring to you personally. So that's an interesting exercise for you to quickly figure out where are you wasting your time and where could it be better spent. And it's hard because people defend their list because they don't want to tell people they're not spending their time in the right places. But it's a healthy audit to get that started. Oops, I can't hear. I apologize.
Sorry, that's me on mute. I'm trying to keep the frogs from croaking.
I heard some. I think it's great.
Yeah, they're loud. They're absolutely horrendous sometimes. Thankfully, when I speak, they tend to stop. I think I've trained them well. But if I'm not speaking, they actually, happily have a go at it. So I keep the mic on mute. My apologies. Nope. Now, you've been you are an educator as well. And one of the things that is great about a practitioner who educates as well is that 9 times out of 10, there's almost always a gap between theory and practice. Mm. And as a practitioner, you can actually spot that and therefore refine the assumptions as well as the theories. So from a trainer perspective, from an educator perspective, when you teach, especially when you talk about tools and techniques, every tool, every technique is contextual and there are limitations. But of course, we can't teach all the limitations and all the context because applying the tool is something that the individual has to do and therefore bring their own context into the equation, which is hard. Teaching it and trying to contextualize it, or actually practicing it and trying to refine the theory, which is harder?
I love the question, and how we teach it is we do both at the same time. So one of the things, and I know you all do something similar, is we're big fans of microlearning, which is everything we do is accelerated. It's 1 hour or less. The cadence is we teach the technique and then we apply it directly to work. So we teach things with intact teams because culture is the work you do in your team every day. And we want to teach things within their sphere of control. So when you work within your team, that's your sphere of control, and that's where the problems happen. Sphere of influence, people can complain to me all day long about corporate structure and expense policies and HR and procurement and legal. They always love to throw those people under the bus, but I'd rather concentrate on their problems. So what we do is we teach a technique. Let's talk about kill a stupid rule again. And we tell people how it works. And then we say, how about you? If you could kill any 2 rules at work, what would they be and why? They have to be in your sphere of control and things that you would be able to kill or change, either at your daily work or with your team. And they are things that aren't, we call them red rules. They're things that aren't government mandated or industry regulated. You know, if you killed those rules, you'd go to jail. Let's not touch those rules. And I will tell you, within an hour, we did this with Pfizer because we applied it to their business. They identified over 100 rules within this one group and killed over 12. And they estimated that it saved them $250,000 and each person 2 to 3 hours a week. Now that's in 1 hour because you quickly teach them the technique and then you apply it. And I think your point is a good one, which is it's not an either or. I think you have to teach the technique first and then apply it immediately after. Because if you teach the technique to them within their own business, they get caught up in their underwear, as we like to say. They're going to give you all the excuses why it's never going to work. It's okay, so let's not do that. Let's learn the technique first and then let's apply it. We do the same thing with something called assumption reversal. The reason you can't change is because you have too many assumptions around why. And so we have them list all the assumptions they have around the problem with, let's say, a restaurant. What are all the things that have to be in a restaurant? And they tell us all those things: chefs, menus, utensils, servers, location. And then we say, well, what if none of those things were true? What if you had to reverse all those assumptions? And they get stuck for a second, but then they really have fun. I said, well, what's the reverse of menus? No menus, bring your own food. What's the reverse of chef? Cook your own, ready to eat. And then they have to come up with a new restaurant based on the reversals. And guess what? They all can do it. So what was assumptions, they totally turned on their head and they created something new and they love it. And then once they go through that, we then say, now let's try it with a real business challenge. And they do it. And it's because we gave them the permission and we gave them a framework to do it. And we took them out of their work first. So there is a gap, but I think only teaching the technique is a mistake, or only having them apply it to business is a mistake. I think it's doing one and then the other is what makes the magic happen.
How do you deal with the resistance though? In the sense that sometimes the people that you work with aren't necessarily the people who have the authority inside the organization. If you're working right at the top, that's great. But most of the time, mid-tiers get trained as much as the top tiers.
That's right.
And within the mid-tier, some of the rules that are really stupid can't really be challenged because they're sacred cows, so to say. Right. So in your line of work, you will bump up against that all the time because you're challenging the very core of the existence of rules and regulations and norms and assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I think that simplicity is the precursor to innovation, because people cannot come up with something new if they're bogged down in all these things that are unnecessary. So simplicity makes the space for new to happen. And what's interesting is we always talk about how the middle managers have it the worst, because I think the way that companies grow is through the middle out. You know, the people in the middle are the ones that people underneath them are aspiring to be them, and people at the top are glad that they're in charge. But they're stuck kind of sandwiched between answering to both. I think that the best thing you can do is, for example, operate in your sphere of control. So the problem for middle managers is they try and tackle too much of the big stuff before they've tackled all the stuff below them. And I think where they can really earn respect from above, like let's use kill a stupid rule, is when they start to show quick low-hanging fruit efficiencies by killing rules in their sphere of control. During that process, they identify things that are in their sphere of influence, and they actually show how many other people have the same issues and can bubble those up to the top. So, you know, simplicity is an efficiency exercise, and it also allows you to kind of prove your worth underneath you before you bubble stuff up to the sphere of influence above you. So I think there are certain things that you're never going to be able to get over as a middle manager, but there are places you can start if you stick in your sphere of control. Starting outside in your sphere of influence, I think you're beating your head against a wall.
I mean, agreed. And I also noticed that you did connect innovation to simplicity, right?
But they're very connected.
But in your own words, and you did mention pushing to the extreme, the thinking. Why is that important, or what do you mean by that?
Well, simplicity makes the space for innovation to happen, because when people are too bogged down, they play it safe, they don't have time, they're stressed. I mean, people today have ADD. They are really time starved. And so that's where simplicity comes in. When I talk about being extreme, I think what we have to do is shake people up and be more provocative with their thinking. So one of the techniques that we will use, let's go back to that assumption reversal exercise, is when you get people in a room and you finally let them think, what's happened is that they don't know how anymore. They're too busy doing, and they've forgotten about thinking. And so when you finally give them the chance to think, they come up with the obvious answers. And if you want to come up with something really disruptive, we've got to give them techniques to stretch them. And one of the things that we do to push them to be more extreme is we do a technique called ideas that would get you fired. And what's really cool about it is that when you get people in a room, after about, in a brainstorm, when 30, 40 minutes goes by and it starts to peak and people stop giving good answers, when you give them the freedom and say, now give me ideas that would get you fired, that are extreme and wild, that would give the boss a heart attack if he walked in, you would be amazed at how many more ideas people come up with. And the thing you have to realize as a boss is don't be scared. You're probably not going to do the ideas that get you fired. But what you are going to come up with are ideas that stretch people a little bit further than they normally would and be more disruptive. It's a cool technique. If you're going through layoffs, don't say ideas to get you fired. Say, give me wild ideas or ideas that would give people a shock. It gets the same results. But if you stretch people and give them permission, they'll do it. And you'd be surprised.
Thank you for that. And I fully agree with you on that. Lisa, just taking you a little bit away from all of this and trying to get into another area that or something that's close to heart, I think, is diversity and inclusion.
Yes.
I know you were on the board for diversity and inclusion, was with Novartis in Switzerland, if I got that right.
That's right.
Somewhere in an article, I did read that diversity and inclusion, if you embrace that within an organization, there is a certain level of a percentage of increase in innovation within that organization. Your thoughts on diversity and inclusion and innovation within an organization and its culture, please.
So I think that diversity and inclusion is important, not from a quota perspective or things like that, but I like to call it the power of perspective. So we know organizations that include lots of different perspectives, and that can be cultural, it can be introvert, extrovert, it can be sexual orientation, it can be color of your skin, whatever you want, religious background. But the idea is to get perspectives. And we want to teach people to stop thinking of it only in terms of male, female, black, white, religion, etc., and start thinking it more of the benefit of new ideas. So for example, we teach a course on curiosity. Now, curiosity is a D&I issue because in most organizations, only certain people are allowed to be curious and ask questions. We teach people how to ask questions, but that doesn't mean everyone feels equal in asking them. And so what we make sure we teach in this course is not just how to ask a curious or killer question, but we also make them think about who would you ask this question to get a new answer. And what's interesting is people never think about who to ask the question to. So if you're, for example, Westin Hotels, the reason they get really great ideas is because they ask customers that have fired them how to improve their business. Most people just bring, their best customers in and say, what do you like about us and what else would you need? Who cares? They're already fans. So if you bring in people that have fired you, that's gold. Most people at executive within a company want to know what are the things that they do that are a waste of time. You know who you ask? new hires, because they're the ones that come in and go, why the hell do you do stuff like this? That's not how I did at my old job. But we don't think about that. And so the reason I think that there's a lot of diversity issues or problems with diversity, well, one, they're systemic, but two, how we teach it is wrong. We put people in a class, we take a webinar, we make people feel like they've been bad, or they've been racist, or they've been, they haven't been inclusive. That doesn't help. If we help teach people skills and how they can make them more inclusive with the skills every day, that will help with innovation.
That's a great way of looking at it, and I couldn't honestly agree more. Kindred spirits in that sense. But I must ask this also, just as a devil's advocate on it. I think, and people who know me to be the most politically incorrect person at times, and I don't.
Uh-oh, I'm going to brace myself here.
No, it's just my role, isn't it? I mean,
you
said it best. You ask questions, and I do too, and I genuinely ask the question. It's not to, cause a mudsling at the end of it, but simplicity. I think the simplest way that one could live is to be surrounded by homogeneity, because you know what to expect. Diversity puts a spanner in the wheel on that. It's a bit like marriage, isn't it? And I know it might be alien in your part of the world, but arranged marriages are very much still a norm, or an accepted norm in our parts of the world. And in an arranged marriage, there's a whole series of interventions to ensure that you marry someone within certain parameters. So you know exactly what kind of a person you're getting married to. In that, your value sets and the way you were brought up and chances are what you do are largely similar. On the other hand, if you get married through a love marriage, you hardly know the parents before you get married. And then there's a whole new problem set to deal with after marriage, because it's the unknown and you navigate that as you see fit. So diversity in that sense throws a spanner in the wheel, so to say, because it's tough because you just don't know where the reference points are of that person, and where they're coming into that equation from. How do you navigate that? I couldn't agree with you more, because I'm a complete believer that diversity and inclusivity in the way you described it, not from a prescriptive perspective, but from the perspective of understanding different perspectives and being able to bring that into the organization, is the only way for an organization to grow. And even as a person, that's the only way for a person to grow. But it is hard work.
Well, simplicity isn't, I really like this question. It's very provocative. It's good. You're good at your job then. So I'm thinking a few things. One is, you don't want simplicity to be the thing where it makes it okay for something like a command and control and process environment is the key to success. So meaning it's very simple. And I'm trying to think the extreme, because that's how we can cut to the chase. If you're somewhere that's very simple, that has a set process and it becomes almost robotic, it is predictable, it might not be fulfilling. And so that's interesting. So that's why I always say, like, as simple as possible, because I think there's something about richness and fulfillment that can come at the detriment of making something too simple, or that doesn't need to be so simplified. So remember, it's kind of like, just because something's organized doesn't mean it's simplified. And the other thing about diversity is, I think there is a certain messiness to it. And I think that's what gives people anxiety about it, because it makes them feel uncomfortable. But change doesn't happen from comfort. Change happens from contrast. And the thing about change, I'm kind of weaving a few things in here, is we seem to mix up contrast and conflict, and they're different. So conflict is this. and we view that as bad. But diversity can be contrast, and that's what we call productive friction. And so while we want to reduce the friction as much as possible, a little bit of it is very important to make sure that we're on the right track. So that's that. Remember, there's a groove and a rut. And when you have a little bit of, there's fulfillment and creativity and diversity, you're in a groove. And I think when you fall into a pattern that doesn't have any sense of fulfillment or happiness or is overly simplified, that's where you start to fall into a rut. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer to it, but that's where the ideas you just gave me were, there are some things where you could oversimplify, and if people aren't satisfied, it's not the right answer.
And just to follow up on that, because I think the work that we do on diversity is something that is very, very close to my heart as well, because most of the time we don't know necessarily, we don't have all the answers for sure, but it's a willingness to navigate it and see. And I think that's one of the key things that we don't teach, that we should be comfortable in not knowing what the outcome will be, versus having a preconceived notion of what the outcome should be and then working backwards. Most of the time we are taught to kind of know exactly what we want and work backwards, right? I mean, that's what management is about. But the reality is, in diversity, you can't do that. You can't have an end state envision and then say, all right, these are the steps that you take towards it. In the work that you do, especially kind of with large organizations who grapple with this, what kind of tips can you give to make sure that journey is undertaken, even though you might not necessarily know exactly where the destination ought to be?
So helping people better deal with the unknown and change?
Yes, especially when it comes to taking on diversity and related aspects.
I think a lot of this has to
do that anymore.
Well, I mean, I think, well, change is, the reason people resist change is fear. And it's also the reason people resist change has a lot to do with our assumptions. So if we can give them a known way to approach it, and if we can take away some of that fear by doing it, they're going to be more open to change. So one of the things that we'll do to attack these assumptions and fear is, first of all, we take problems and we break them into parts. And the reason some people resist change, right, is because it seems too big. So breaking it down makes it more comfortable. And then we take the parts of a problem and we attack the assumptions around it. Because you don't have to change everything. People get extreme. You just have to change some of those things, or maybe question them and reinforce why they're okay to keep. We use a tool called impossible to possible. And what's interesting is it's pretty simple. What you do is you take a problem or a process and you break it into parts, and you have people list, choose one of the parts, all the things that they think are impossible around that problem or that process to changing it. These are all the reasons why it'll never change. And they have to list like 10 things. As soon as they're done, and they can do this individually or with a partner, they have to give their list of impossibles away. And the person who receives them has to make them possible. And what's cool about that is we experience something called cognitive distance. We are better at solving other people's problems than solving our own, right? You know this as a learning expert. So, giving it away, you've probably seen this, is people love to solve everyone else's problems. And they're pretty good at it. And so they make everybody's impossibles possible because they get rid of the assumptions that person had. And that's one of the tools that we think is really cool and powerful for people that are stuck in a rut and can't seem to find a fixable solution to a barrier that they have. Giving people structure and then giving them permission, that goes a long way to helping them change.
Anthony's texting me saying, here we go again. You're not gonna exceed time limits that has been given. So I'm going to make this quick, but I do have a two-part question, and bringing that back all to you once again, because part of our attempt in having in conversation with is to try and weave what you do with who you are. And oftentimes, there is a part to you which is, of course, the work you do, but there's a part to you that has nothing to do with the work you do. But all of this comes into being a symbiotic mix of who you become and who you are. So right throughout your life's journey, in the kind of, when I read through your bio, what was really interesting is from an author to working in inclusion to simplicity to a futurist. They don't necessarily seem aligned, even though they're quite far off. I mean, if you were an artist and a singer, yeah, there's some semblance of, and then you moved into a little bit of pottery here and there. That's all within the fine arts, and we are comfortable. But they're very, very differing things. How do you kind of make sense of all of it, so to say? That's one. And the final part of it was, how has that enriched you as a person?
So that's a great question. And first of all, I think in the way that I put them all together is because innovation is about connecting different dots. It used to be everything was about a straight line, and it was command and control, and it was moving up the ladder, and things were more predictable. And with technology and so much change that comes with it, I think that's where innovation is more about connecting different dots, or dots that we don't even know exist yet. And so, being able to simplify allows you to see which dots to connect. Being innovative and creative lets you connect dots in different ways. And diversity kind of unearths dots that you didn't know that you should look at in the first place, right? That's that power perspective. I think the thing to think about from me personally that really resonated is, as a futurist, I think it's the same thing for companies as it is for people. The future isn't about who you are. The future is about who you're becoming. And the best leaders the leaders of today can tell me who they are and what their companies do. But the winning leaders of tomorrow are the ones that are always going to be able to tell me who they're becoming. And that means they're always looking ahead, like BMW isn't going to sell cars, they're going to rent engine capacity. Shell Oil isn't going to extract energy, they're going to grow it. They're looking at things in a new way, even if they sound crazy. And the thing that helps me think about is, and what is fulfilling to me personally, is this is about potential. I think the biggest waste is untapped potential, where people weren't empowered to use it. And I think the most fulfilling thing is meeting your potential. And the more creative we can be about it and solve bigger problems, that's my inspiring thing I want people to do, the more potential and happy we can be.
Well, I'm going to pass it on to Anthony before he kind of...
Lisa, thank you for that. So for everyone who's joined in, we were in conversation with Lisa Bodell, an award-winning author and CEO of FutureThink, an organization that promotes accelerated, flexible learning solutions to engage teams, to help build businesses faster, and to create a culture of collaboration from anywhere. With their award-winning accelerated learning approach, they have transformed how teams work in organizations such as Pfizer, Google, Merck, Airbnb, and many more. This was an hour designed to bring inspiration through the backstories of modern-day icons. On that note, Lisa, thank you very, very much for carving out a moment in time from your undoubtedly busy schedule. I can honestly say that this has been an hour which has been very insightful, what stories, and certainly an amazing takeaway of pure inspiration. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. You guys are excellent moderators, so thanks for making it fun.
Thank you. And to our audience, thank you very much for staying tuned in, and I hope you've enjoyed this segment. We do have another interesting personality lined up for the segment next week, so do watch our social media spaces for the links to join in. If you've missed part of this conversation, it will be up on our YouTube channel. Do visit, do subscribe, do hit that notification button to stay updated, and remember to share. A huge shout out to our technology partners, H1, Samath and his team, for going strong with our third season. With this, I bid you a wonderful rest of the day. Stay safe, stay productive.